Hey guys, I'm Gavin Rubluski, and today we're going to go over all of the different aspects of opping a handheld. Firstly, let's talk about the camera we use. We're using Red Komodos. Love these cameras. They have phenomenal sensors. They're 6K. The image that comes out of them is gorgeous. You'll notice they're small, which is both great and sometimes challenging. Part of the reason that can be challenging is because we don't have a lot of I/O with them being this small. So we have to rely on a lot of third-party accessories, which is okay because we can build them out however we want. So obviously, as you can tell, this is the body of the camera. On the front of it, we've got the lens mount, and this body has an adapter on it that goes from EF to RF. This is where you attach all of your lenses or adapters if you need to adapt from one mount type to another. You'll notice this one also has a cage on it, and this cage just gives us more mounting options for different kinds of hardware. Now to power the camera on, you've got the switch right here on the right side. Below that, you've got the record button. If you're ever opting a service that requires you to record in camera, this is where you'll hit the record button. Now on the left side, you've got this little latch that opens up, and that's where the CFast cards go. So anytime we record, this is where you'll put them in. There's also an exhaust vent, and obviously more of the cage. On the back side, you've got 2 battery mounts, as well as 3 different inputs. The 2 that you'll be most concerned about is the DC in, which is power, and then the SDI out, which is how you get your video signal from the camera anywhere else. And on the top side, you've got the monitor, and it's a touchscreen monitor, and this is where you make all of your settings adjustments. But there's a menu button, there's a scrolling up and down button, a select, and then a play button if you want to watch back videos on the camera. All right, now let's go over the third-party components we use. Firstly, an I/O expander. This just slides right on the back of the Komodo, right in this battery slide, and then plugs into the exit port. This is just to expand the Komodo's I/O. This gives us a Genlock SDI port, a 5-volt USB out, a control input, a time code input, and an R/S input. Next, we've got this battery slide for V-mount batteries. This just slides into the other open battery mount. Slides in just like that, and then it plugs right into the DC in LEMO port. Next, we have a wireless transmitter, and the models might change, the brands might change. The most important thing is making sure that you are transmitting video and that your SDI is plugged into the right port. The ports should be labeled in and out. There are several different kinds of inputs. This model specifically has an HDMI input, and then an SDI out, and then an SDI in. But this is what SDI cables look like. Sometimes they'll have right angles. We love the right angled ones. You want to make sure that the SDI is plugged into the in port on your transmitter. That means your video signal is coming from the camera, going into the transmitter, and then wirelessly being sent to the receiver. Generally, we'll mount these guys with friction arms. The location may change depending on the kind of handheld rig you're using, or what lens you're using, or however it's set up. If you have a preference, you're more than welcome to make adjustments, but it's important to know how your wireless transmitter works. Now that you know some of the basic parts of the camera, let's talk about this rig. This rig has a monitor attached to a top handle. It's got a side handle as well. The wireless transmitter is on a friction arm on the left side. It's got a V-mount battery and a lens. Let's talk about lenses. So there are 3 main things to think about when it comes to a lens. The first being the zoom, second being the focus, and third being the iris. Let's talk about focus first. It's pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, we want to keep our subjects in focus, but sometimes we'll push focus between different subjects. Focus can be a tough thing to master, especially being able to adjust quickly on the fly or move between multiple subjects. The zoom on a lens is measured in millimeters. The lower the number, the wider angle. The higher the number, the tighter it'll be. This is a 25 to 250 millimeter lens. It can go pretty wide and then punch in tight again. This is what's called a prime lens, and that just means it doesn't zoom. So it's got all manual controls, a manual iris, and a manual focus. This is a 35 millimeter, so it's not super wide. It's also not super tight. It's kind of a nice in between. This is a 70 to 200. This lens will generally use in the pit. It's not as wide as the 25 to 250 or the 35, but it goes pretty tight. This lens has something called stabilization on it. Manual lenses generally won't have stabilization, and the stabilization just helps you from being shaky. So if your arms are getting tired, if you're making small adjustments while you're moving, it'll smooth those out and make it nice and steady. There's also autofocus on this lens. We never use autofocus. The final thing with lenses is the iris. I briefly mentioned this has a manual iris. More often than not, you'll find you can adjust the iris digitally. These 25 to 250s, you cannot adjust it digitally, so you'll have to adjust it on the actual iris ring. The iris controls two things. The first being exposure, and second being the area of focus. I'll talk about exposure first. The lower the number, the brighter the image will be. The higher the number, the darker it'll be. This 35 opens all the way up to 1.5. It closes all the way to 22. Quick little sidetrack. There are multiple different names for iris. The word iris is just describing what the physical component is doing on the inside of the lens. It's generally called f-stop. However, in the video world, it'll also be referred to as t-stop. Depth of field means how big or small of an area of focus you have. The smaller the number, the smaller the area of focus will be. The higher the number, the wider the area of focus will be. We'll generally run our lenses wide open. Now let's quickly talk about settings. The first setting is frames per second. The next is ISO. After ISO is iris or f-stop. After f-stop is shutter angle, and finally white balance. To control the exposure of the camera, or how bright or dark the camera is, you'll use your ISO, your iris, or your shutter angle. We tend to leave our shutter angle at 144, primarily because we film around a lot of LED walls, as well as it gives a nice motion blur when subjects are moving in the frame. Your ISO is artificial light, so that's the camera digitally putting in light into the frame, and each camera has a different native ISO. Native just means where the ISO will look best in all environments. The iris also controls how much light gets to the sensor. White balance determines how warm or cold the image looks. There are different white balance settings for different environments. The current white balance setting we're using is 4400 Kelvin. If you were to shoot outside, people generally land between 5500 and 6500 Kelvin. Now to describe the look we're trying to achieve from the handhelds, it's best shown rather than described. Here's some example footage of what we're looking for. You'll notice there's a fair amount of movement. There's not any harsh whips or panning. You'll also notice that sometimes we'll drift from one subject to another. It's crucial that you have a lot of shots lined up so that when the director takes you, you're able to quickly move from one shot to another. Here's an example of a handheld going from one subject to another very quickly. You'll notice that they dial in their zoom before they get their focus. This is a general practice for all of our handheld ops, simply because it's important to get the subject framed and then adjust the focus, because it gives the director an idea for what they're able to cut to next. There is a lot of different little features. Over time, with practice, you'll get the hang of it. That just about concludes the general overview of our handheld cameras.